Hello, I'm Nichaela Farrell. I'm a horror actress, and you might know me from the public domain horror Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey 2. I've always been interested in real-life horrors as well as fictional ones, and true crime mysteries. Within this documentary, I'm going to be finding out the truth behind Jack the Ripper. I'll be interviewing experts on what they know about him and about the case, conspiracy theories, and speculations around it. I'm intrigued to find out why, 120 years later, we are still fascinated with this case. Hi, Adrian.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming out here.
No problem.
So where is this first location?
This is Whitechapel. You've got to imagine 1888, Victorian London. Queen Victoria had been on this throne for 50 years, and she was the queen of the largest empire the world had ever seen. So there was immense wealth, fantastic balls, clothes, parks, horses, carriages, the most unimaginable amount of money.
And at the time, London was one of the biggest cities, right?
It was the biggest city in the world.
Wow.
But that was up there, up west. This was the east. Whitechapel was one of the rookeries, which was the phrase they used for the very poor areas of London, which there were several. Whitechapel, this was the worst of the lot. It was a whole area of poor quality housing. They were hovels, they were disease-infested, lice-infested, damp, appalling places to live.
Could you talk a bit about the human experience back then, how that may have affected them on a day-to-day?
Right. In 1880, the biggest killer for most people would have been smallpox. So that was the biggest killer in the East End, followed by scarlet fever and tuberculosis, which were all current diseases of the time. The dysentery and typhoid and were rife in the East End. The East End of London was like almost ghetto of London. The reason being because the winds that blow down, you can feel them coming down from the west down towards the east. They would have taken all the rubbish and all the diseases and all the molecules and dirt down to the East End. So to live in the East End, you were constantly fighting against deprivation as well as the ecological problems from the west.
Yeah, I can't imagine that smelled very nice either.
It was pretty rank. Obviously, things like the sewage system, which was emptying straight into the Thames, where there was no safeguard. Bazalgette, of course, came in at some point and started putting sewers into central London. They didn't quite reach as far as the East End, because they were to serve the West End people. So it was a pretty horrible place to live.
Life was very wretched, particularly for the women. The men had got some work. There was the abattoirs, which were down there towards the Thames, where the animals came in from Europe. And there were huge numbers of slaughterhouses and tanneries. There was also the building over there behind you, because that's Spitalfields Market, which was being built between 1885 and 1891. So there was a lot of construction work. Where we're standing now, Jack the Ripper would know exactly where we are, because that pub, the 10 Bells pub, is really the centre of the whole Jack the Ripper story. Because all the 5 girls probably knew each other, and they all probably drank in that pub. Over there was Dorset Street. That was the roughest, most dangerous street in London.
See.
If you started with your possessions as you went at the top of the street, you sure as hell wouldn't have them by the time you got to the bottom.
Wow. So the poverty kind of influenced a lot of crime.
Absolutely. But not murders.
Crime was quite common back then. Was murder the same way quite common as well?
Okay, there's a lot of myths about how common murder was back then. Certainly, you get lots of films and documentaries and everybody's having their throats slit or being murdered on the streets. Murder was quite uncommon. So some of the statistics we have is that for the whole of the UK at that point, there were only 300 murders for the whole year, for the whole of the UK. One set of figures I've seen said in Whitechapel, in London, there were 69 murders for the whole year. So there were 30 male and 39 female. So that's actually a really low murder rate. Only like 69 for the whole of London for the whole of that year.
So that's why the Ripper murders with the disemboweling created such appalling mayhem around the world, so much so that it started tabloid newspapers, because the newspapers suddenly realised here was a story. Even the New York Times published daily for the hunt for Jack the Ripper.
So this was common knowledge to a lot of people.
Oh yes, this was the first really viral murder.
So could you tell me about the atmosphere of this pub that night?
Oh, it was rough. I mean, it's always rough. They're all drinking gin. This bathtub brewed gin. It's so strong it'll melt the paint off the inside of the bath. Okay. Probably heard me say it already, but that's the case. And I mean, it was, you had a full pennorth of gin and you were absolutely out for the count.
Roughly how many people would have been in this pub?
100 or so probably, but they were all known to each other because it's quite a sort of small area.
Okay.
Anyway, she went out to earn her 4p, the only way she knew how, and it was called a fourpenny knee trembler. When she went outside, she got her 4p, and she had sex against the wall with a client, and that's why they called it a knee trembler.
So what are the sort of jobs that people at the time would have had? Talk a bit more about the sex industry that the victims were a part of.
A lot of the women would work typically in factories and things like that. The Jack the Ripper victims all had some form of menial job, like working as cleaners was a common one. If you were living in the lodging house, you might be able to earn your lodging money by cleaning the rooms and that kind of thing. But then if you couldn't get the work and you might have a family or children who were starving, a lot of the women as well would be forced to be stealing or robbing things, or indeed selling themselves in the street, which was something that was very widespread and commonplace in Whitechapel in 1888 at the time the murders were taking place.
So this was the pub, and this was the route down to her lodgings at Thal Street, where she'd been kicked out.
Right.
Then at about 3:40 a.m, a policeman found the body of Mary Ann Nichols right here.
Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly Nichols, was the Ripper's first victim. Aged around 44, she'd been drinking heavily and was found in Bucks Row in Whitechapel.
When Mary Ann Nichols was murdered, she'd had her throat cut violently and had had a number of incisions cut into her abdomen. When the body was removed to the mortuary, it was said that her intestines were actually exposed through the wounds. That was the first time that we see anything like that.
How long do you think that murder would have taken in that time?
Less than 10 minutes.
Wow.
It was a very quick thing, and all the Ripper murders, with one exception, were in the 10-minute period.
Considering the proximity of how close the pub was, how comes nobody would have known?
It was dark.
I see.
There was no street lighting. Occasional sort of gas lamps, but that's all there was.
And I assume there would have been a lot of gentlemen that looked like him that night.
Yeah, I think so, because this was an area for prostitutes, and so people used to come from the West End down here for their pleasure, for their gentleman's pleasure, because quite a lot of men liked it rough, and rough is what you got here in the East End.
So tell me, how would this have set off the police investigation?
Well, the police took initially a lot of interest in this because actually this was the second murder in fairly short succession. In August, a lady called Martha Tabram had been killed, not with such savagery.
So the police at the time said there were at least 8 murders. Nowadays, everybody agrees on 5, maybe 6, and they debate whether the other few murders were the same man. The police at the time said there were 8 murders, all by the same man. Inspector Edmund Reed, who was the chief of CID in Whitechapel at the time, when he wrote his memoirs much later on as an older man, he said there were at least 9 murders. He never said who the 9th one was. But the 8 murders that were attributed to him at the time began with the murder of a lady called Martha Tabram, who was 39 years old. She was murdered on Gunthorpe Street in Whitechapel on the 7th of August 1888. She'd been stabbed 39 times, but aside from that, hadn't been mutilated in the way that the other victims were.
But the police looked at it, they thought, no, there's no connection between the two. But because it was Whitechapel, they put Detective Inspector Fred Aberline on the case, and he stayed on the Ripper case right the way through to the end.
Annie Chapman was the second victim, and an alcoholic 47-year-old widow. Annie was found in Hanbury Street.
This is what was 29 Hanbury Street. This was where the second murder happened on the 8th of September 1888. It was 47-year-old Annie Chapman. Now, Annie Chapman was, like the others, was a prostitute. She was a chronic alcoholic. She also had tuberculosis, and she probably wouldn't have lasted more than a couple of weeks anyway. that she was seen talking to a man. One of the few descriptions we've got, actually, of the man who was possibly the Ripper. He was about 5'7". He was of fair complexion. He got a moustache, and he had what they called a genteel foreign appearance.
Right.
Now, in those days, that meant around here that meant Jewish.
In the earlier part of the 1880s, a lot of persecution had taken place sort of in Eastern Europe and parts of Russia that had forced tens of thousands of Jewish people to flee. So the majority of them had actually gone to the United States. But of those who didn't, the second place where everybody came was to London, in particular if you arrived just with the clothes on your back into the East End. So in a fairly short space of time, a large Jewish population had appeared.
The pogroms of Russia and Poland in the 19th century brought in thousands of Jews, just as the Huguenots had come in 200 years before, and indeed the Bangladeshis in the 1970s. So Whitechapel is where there are lots of people coming in all the time. This was a boarding house.
Right.
And this was a house that had 17 people in it. And there was a passage that ran right the way through. And she was seen talking to this man, and she then went into the house with him, possibly, and she wasn't seen again until 6 o'clock the next morning, when a man called John Davis went out the back door and he saw the body on the floor.
So 8 days after the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, when Annie Chapman was found in the rear yard of number 29 Hanbury Street, the crime scene displayed a much higher level of violence than anything that we'd seen before. She was lying on her back with her legs apart, her clothes pulled up chest high, her throat had been cut violently. There was a large pool of blood lying by her left side. The killer, it would appear, had gone through her pockets. She was wearing a pocket underneath her coat and the clothing she was wearing. He'd arranged the objects at the bottom of her feet. There was a broken comb, a broken mirror, a torn piece of muslin material, a toothbrush in a paper case. It then appears he'd placed her legs wide apart and cut an incision from her groin all the way up to her sternum. He appears to have taken out her intestines, perhaps thrown them into her face, and then they're placed across the right shoulder. Parts of her abdomen were missing from the crime scene. If he didn't eat them at the crime scene, which could be seen as a possibility in similar murder cases today, he took them with him as souvenirs or trophies to relive his fantasies. Before fleeing the crime scene, though, he would appear to have smeared the blood from a throat wound across the inside of her thighs, across the wall, possibly under the back wall of the house as he went through the back door, and then fled.
The cleanliness of the incisions suggest her killer may have had some knowledge of anatomy.
There's lots of speculation about the murderer being a butcher or a doctor. How much do you think these theories hold up?
It depends on whether or not you look at it's basically down to the skill involved or that's visible in the commission of the murders. There was a distinction between surgical skill and anatomical knowledge to begin with, and doctors at the time and still disagree about the extent to which the murderer knew what he was doing. Some say that doing something like extracting the kidney from one of the victims wasn't an easy thing to do, so it suggests that there was anatomical knowledge and some degree of surgical skill to remove it in darkness and in the conditions that you would be in if you were murdering somebody and you're fearing immediate discovery. But somebody else has said, well, maybe he just put his hand in, rooted around and took out whatever he got hold of. It's a bit gruesome, sort of the second point, but it just illustrates the problem that you've got. If it was done deliberately, then it illustrates that the person had the skill of a surgeon or the knowledge of a butcher or a doctor or somebody who knew what it was like. But then on the other hand, if he did just grab what came to hand, then perhaps there was no skill involved at all. Although maybe there's skill involved in even putting your hand in and grabbing hold of something. So
it's possible. I mean, there were huge slaughterhouses over there. People used to cutting up animals.
Yeah.
There was a Spitalfields market, which used to be up the top. So it wasn't unusual for people to know about what was inside a body. And a pig's kidney is very similar to human kidney. So you never really know.
Adrian, could you tell me about the double event night?
Ah, right. Well, after those last two murders, the press had an absolute field day. I mean, they were all over the murders, the Whitechapel murders. They were all over the national and international press. And of course, in all these situations, there's always a crank that writes. And somebody wrote a letter that started, "Dear Boss."
So that was, it's written on the 25th of September in red ink, pretending to be, well, purporting to be from the murderer himself. And it sort of starts, "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet." And it sort of goes on for 2 pages, taunting and teasing the police, saying things like, "I tried to write with the proper red stuff, but it went thick like glue. I hope red ink is fit enough, ha ha." Taunting and teasing, and he signs it at the end, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper."
The press had their name. Suddenly, Jack the Ripper was what this person was called.
So that letter gave the famous murderer his name, didn't it? Possibly written by a journalist. People then and now think it was possibly written by a journalist and not the murderer. And a couple of people's names have been put forward for the identity of that journalist.
There were things that the police did which the press picked up on, such as the publication of the Dear Boss letter, which was a letter allegedly sent by the murderer, and the police published that letter. That then produced a whole load of correspondence from the public, all of whom signing these letters Jack the Ripper, or either suggesting things that the police could do to catch the murderer, or pretending to be the murderer and threatening to do other crimes.
There must have been quite a few cranks and crazy people all wanting attention. Sadly, we get that now with murder cases. But, you know, a couple of ladies were actually even arrested. One, Maria Coroner in Bradford, was actually arrested for writing hoax Ripper letters. So the impact of the murders spread not just throughout London, not just throughout the UK, but globally. And through the newspapers, this really was one of the first, you know, sort of series of murders. There's no such term as serial killer at this point in history. That's a modern term. But certainly this series of unsolved murders, and very brutal and very vicious, what he's doing to these ladies. The press had a field day, as you can imagine. And this became a global sensation, not just local.
Could you kind of elaborate on how publications worked back then, how media kind of covered these events?
One shouldn't think of the newspapers then as they are now. The front pages of newspapers were covered in advertisements, small, tiny advertisements. So they weren't things like headlines as such. You had small column width headlines and subheads. And so the murders also weren't on the front page. They were somewhere inside most newspapers. And they gave the crimes either a small amount of space, or they sometimes gave a full page or a half page or more than a full page to reporting the crimes. Initially, of course, they didn't, the early murders weren't reported in great depth. But as the murders progressed, the more space was given.
But the Jack the Ripper case was the first of those sort of cases to receive anywhere near that amount of newspaper attention. So in the earlier part of the 1800s, there were only really a couple of newspapers you could buy. There were these big broadsheets. They were very expensive. Only rich people were buying them. And the rich people buying these didn't want to read about death and misery in the slums. It was only kind of as we got further through the 1800s, they started lessening the taxes on the newspapers. Once we got to the 1880s, here's the tabloid press as we would know it today, sprung up almost overnight.
And there were certain newspapers like the Star, which was a sensationalist newspaper in many ways. And that was actually began publication in 1888, the year of the murders. And the way it approached the crimes boosted its circulation tremendously and established it as a major newspaper of the time.
The newspapers wanted to have copy, as it's called. They wanted to have a story, and if the story didn't fit, they would expand it a little bit. So consequently, they would be looking for angles in which to make something of interest for the readers. So by mentioning names who have been in the area, or who had recently been disgraced, or who had, in the case of John Dewart, who committed suicide soon after the killer murders happened. And William Gull was implicated at one point. Even Gladstone was called into question because he did good works for the people in the area. All those instances fed the machine of publicity. And that publicity, like fake news it is today, drummed up a lot of interest. And of course, a lot of interest drums up sales. So that is why they tried to drum up the celebrity angle to it. In the same way, if you have, Jade Goody or some stories about Jordan, or we buy them because think, I wonder what's happened to her. The same thing with these cases. They weren't of any interest really to most people, but if you put a celebrity spin on them, people will start buying the papers.
Well, like all newspapers, there were people who sort of would exaggerate the story a bit, to sensationalize it a bit. But when you get into the body of a newspaper report, the journalist wasn't, generally speaking, making things up. They were reporting, as far as we can tell, they were reporting things that were fairly accurate, that they were told by other people. Now, certain times, the rush to get the information into the newspaper led to complete fictions being published.
With the penny dreadfuls and the sleazy sex, death, murder tabloids that were now available to anybody, and the people who were reading these now did want to hear about these horrible murders and mutilations. So it was the first time you had a case like that, where the murder would happen, and then the paparazzi of the day would be there on the scene in big bunches, getting the scoop the next day to report all these graphic details in the newspaper. So it wasn't the first time you had a case like this. It wasn't the worst time necessarily. There had been other murders, even in the Whitechapel area, but it was far and away the most notorious, with the most press coverage.
But the whole of the East End was in fear and trembling what happens next. There had been 2 terrible murders. They were waiting to see what happened next. They were scared to go out. They didn't know who it was. It was a man, it was a woman. And then on the night of the 29th and 30th of September 1888, 6 weeks later, suddenly they had what was known as a double event.
Elizabeth Stride was 45 when she met Jack the Ripper that night. She was found in Dutfield's Yard, a dark alley off Burner Street.
A man who was the steward of a club in Berners Street, now Enrica Street, was taking his horse and cart back into the stables because his sideline was to sell costume jewellery up the West End. And his horse stopped because there was something in the yard. And he got out a match and he struck it. It was quite a windy night. And he suddenly saw a face. And as the match blew out, he also saw a pile of rags which looked like a body on the floor. He thought it was his wife, because his wife was known to like a drink or two. And so he had picked her up from the yard before, so nothing unusual. So he went into the pub to get a lantern. And the first person he saw was his wife. So he grabbed the lantern, went outside, and underneath the tarpaulin was this body.
She was found with a throat cut violently, with a pool of blood next to her, polished up the same way as the other victims. She was lying the same way as Annie Chapman was, but hadn't been mutilated.
Now, she had only had one slash across her neck. Hadn't been mutilated, hadn't been cut up, just one slash across her neck to kill her. The theory is that when he struck the match, the face that he saw was Jack the Ripper. By the time he'd gone out, he'd gone.
The warmth of her body and the lack of any mutilation suggested that the Ripper may have been interrupted during the murder.
The murder of Elizabeth Stride in Burner Street, she was discovered at about 1:01 by a guy called Louis Deemschutz, who actually lived and worked in the working men's club that she was murdered at the side of, Dutfield's Yard. The side entrance was the kitchen door. She was basically right in front of the kitchen door. He'd been returning home from work and had found her by the door in the yard there. So some people say, because the yard was so dark, it was said you had to feel your way across the wall to get to the door. Some people's theory is he must have been in the middle of doing the murder when he's pulled in with his pony and cart, and then because it was so dark, he must have hid behind a gate or something, and then when he's gone for help, He's taken off running, and that explains why she wasn't mutilated or whatever. But she was found on her back with a head to the side, with a hand across her chest, objects around her, blood smeared across her hand and her forearm. He'd taken the time to do this, but he hadn't done the mutilating. And the first doctor on the scene there was actually a Dr. Blackwell, who was called because he lived at the end of the street. So when the police turned up, he was, they woke him up, got him out of bed, got him to the crime scene. He arrived there at 1:15, and he said the murder had taken place 20 to 30 minutes before he got there. So he said by the time the body was discovered, she'd been there for at least 5 or 6 minutes and possibly a full quarter of an hour. So I think the fact that the doctor gave the time of death at that time and she was posed up like that, I don't think he was actually disturbed at that crime scene at all. He might have been unhappy with the crime scene. He might not have intended to do it there. Even by his standards, it was an outrageously dangerous place to do the murder, at the side of the working men's club. As the murder was taking place, him and Elizabeth Stride would have been able to hear people on the other side of that door drinking beers and playing piano and singing songs. I think he's perhaps done it impulsively there, being unhappy with the crime scene and taken off running, and wasn't actually disturbed at all. But usually people say he was disturbed, and that's why he mustn't have done the mutilations.
So he was unsatisfied in the sense that he had to find another victim?
After committing the murder of Elizabeth Stride, though, yes, it would appear that he's fled to wherever it is in the area that he is comfortable and safe, in his house, and he lives immediately nearby. The murder of Catherine Eddowes took place, give or take, about 45-50 minutes after the murder of Elizabeth Stride, but to walk from one spot to the other takes about 12 minutes.
Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old with kidney disease, was found near Mitre Square.
Less than an hour later, about a 1:45 in the morning, a policeman found a body here in Mitre Square, and it was identified as Catherine Eddowes.
So Catherine was actually arrested on the night she died at 8:30 in the evening for being drunk, disorderly, and apparently, according to one source, impersonating a fire engine. So she's taken to Bishopsgate Police Station to sober up, and it sort of gets around midnight, and one of the police officers going to the cell, and she says, when can I go? When can I leave? And they said, when you're sober, when you're ready to go, we'll let you out. So 1 o'clock comes, and she's let out. PC Hutt sort of lets her out the back door onto Bishopsgate, and she says to him, he says, well, make sure you shut the door on your way out. And she says, right, no problem. Good night, old cock. Those are her last known words. Very sad. And what is sad is because people may not know, but London even today has 2 major police forces. And so all of our victims, apart from Catherine, were murdered on the Metropolitan Police area or territory. Catherine was killed on the City of London police territory. She was also arrested on city territory, which meant that as soon as you're sober, they would kick you out. But if she'd been arrested a few feet on the other side, on the different territory, the Metropolitan Police would have kept her in a cell all night. She would never have died.
She had been arrested by Bishopsgate Police for being drunk and disorderly, and she'd been kept in the police station most of the evening. And then they let her out. Within 10 minutes, she was seen talking to a man just opposite St. Bartov's Church over there. And he apparently said to her, will you? And she said, I will.
Now, sort of not far away is the church known as St. Botolph's, and some people have called that the prostitute church because the prostitutes used to walk around it to get clients. Maybe she met Jack there. She must have met him en route.
Yeah.
And certainly she's seen alive at the entrance to a little church passage which led into Mitre Square by 3 men who had just come out the Imperial Club next door, 2 Jewish guys. So they sort of last saw her alive, really, at the entrance to that passageway, and she was quite happily chatting to someone, hand on his chest. And that's the last time she's seen. And then she's found in the darkest corner of Mitre Square.
Now, Mitre Square in those days, it's all been redeveloped now, but in those days was a series of high-value warehouses right the way around, with a little narrow passage here, now called St. James's Passage, then called Mitre Passage. And there had been some burglaries, and so the City of London Police patrolled this without fail every 15 minutes. And if there wasn't a policeman here every 15 minutes, trouble was made for that policeman. In the 15 minutes between one patrol and the policeman finding her, the Ripper had brought her in here and slashed her twice, left a huge hole in her abdomen, taken her intestines, thrown it over her shoulder, taken her heart, taken her uterus, taken her bladder, spleen. Most appalling sight.
And it must have been horrific because the policeman, it's like a ghost kills her in that square. There's hardly anybody really living in it, but there were 2 night watchmen present in the square, one with the door open. There was a policeman, PC Pierce, living in the square with his family, literally opposite the murder site, and nobody hears or sees a thing. But what I'm pretty sure myself is that all of Jack's victims sadly led themselves to their own doom.
Yeah.
As streetwalkers, they would have known the best places to go for a quick sexual transaction. They would have known the darkest places to go, possibly the safest places. They would have also known the policeman's beats. Right, we've got 6 minutes before the policeman's due here on his beat. They would have known those timings, I'm pretty sure. If Jack was mentally disturbed or was frothing at the mouth or looked really ill, I would certainly not be going down anywhere, dark alleyways with these type of people. So as a woman, you'd have to trust that person. So he must have looked very normal. And if it's really late in the hours of the morning, what type of person would I have trusted on the streets? Maybe a policeman? Did Jack dress as a policeman to escape detection? Was he a policeman? I guess we don't know. The other type of man I might have trusted, someone with a white collar, a religious looking man. But as a female, I'm always thinking, this person, whoever Jack was, must have looked and sounded very normal, very happy or whatever, do you know what I mean, for us ladies to go with him.
Well, there were some people who actually got attacked but survived as well. People tend not to be as aware of that. If you go digging through the files, there were a few survivors who got attacked but got away. And they always give a similar kind of story. So the victim was usually a desperate, destitute, vulnerable woman in the street in the middle of the night in the Whitechapel, Spitalfields area, when suddenly they'd met this guy in the street who had offered them money to go with them. Then you would go to that spot, and then suddenly he'd flipped and he'd attacked and hit them and tripped them up and tried to strangle them and pull a blade, and then they'd run away. And then they realised once he'd actually ran away that the money he'd given you were fake coins. That tends to be forgotten about now, but the police reports always talk about these fake coins that these survivors produced. And it was typically valueless coins that had been polished particularly brightly to look like gold ones, and then crimped and machined around the edges, it was said, to appear to be half crowns or sovereign coins. And then when he got to the spot, he'd attack, you'd scared him off, he'd run away, and then this is what they believe you would do. He would con you with fake money to get you to the spot, he would do the deed, it would appear if he did that for the other victims, he took the money back with him, and then he runs.
Most likely he would have gone up to the ladies themselves and said, are you looking for the business? That was a phrase sometimes used, the business. We don't know exactly. Or he may have just gone up to them and offered them a drink, or just occasionally we've had a witness statement saying somebody tapped Mary Jane Kelly, for example, our last victim, on the shoulder. She was laughing. There was a bit of a conversation going. And then obviously the conversation about sex work must have happened. What's interesting about Catherine, I should say, she came back from hop picking in Kent, where she'd been earning some money. And apparently she told people, I know who the Whitechapel murderer is and I'm going to get the reward.
Wow.
Interesting.
And how long was that before her murder?
Only a couple of days.
Oh my gosh.
I think that if that's true, and she did say that, and there is a source to say that, I think that's fascinating.
One of the things that happened at the time was that the public started suggesting people, which could be their neighbours or friends or enemies, or some chap who lived down the road that they thought behaved oddly. So these people were often being taken into police stations and being questioned, and then immediately released.
So the police took that as to be quite helpful information in those cases?
No, I think the police at the time actually thought it was troublesome and frustrating to the investigation. Just they were having to investigate all these spurious stories as they turned out, and which was taking people off the proper investigation. The Metropolitan Police had amongst the journalists, had a very bad reputation for not giving information away.
So actually the police were really kind of informed from the powers that be not to really communicate with the press. They were told not to talk to the press. And in fact, policemen talking to the press and other people and revealing confidential information is actually something that they could have been reprimanded for within the police force at that time. And one of the things, if you look at the list of sort of huge list of things the police can and cannot do as an officer, as a constable on the street, one of them was to gossip. with people. I'm sure that happens, but
Yeah.
that was actually a reprimandable thing. They could have got punishment for that. And I'm sure, you know, they would have talked in their local pubs and that, but for the press, they were really instilled not to say anything, especially the guys on the streets, the PCs.
So were the police ever depicted as any sort of way, or was there a narrative about the police in these papers?
There was a great dissatisfaction with the police. I mean, in the same situation really as there is now, a dissatisfaction with the police. And the commissioner in particular came in, Sir Charles Warren. He came in for a very bad time with the press. He had, for example, he was brought in specifically because it was felt that the police needed a firm hand in and to have some reorganization. He would probably have done quite well, but for the Ripper crimes. He was not really in a position to respond to those very well.
And in fact, we have contemporary press images within the press from like Punch magazine, sort of like satirical magazines, sort of showing the police represented with a blindfold on as blind man's buff, being circled, hidden by all these criminals around them, because that's the police were seen as useless basically by many people. They're not catching this murderer.
Previous years there had been demonstrations by the poor and particularly by the unemployed, and they'd gone to Trafalgar Square and there was a riot, and the police didn't come out of that particularly well, their handling of it.
And we have to remember that because this melting pot of cultures in the East End, we have so many immigrants, so many people can't speak English. This is another thing. So the local people really don't want to help the police out, especially because a lot of the local people, not all, but a lot, are criminals. So they don't want to be helping the police out when it could then focus on their own, you know, habits and what they're getting up to.
And how did the police react to this press coverage?
So that I think the police as a whole during the investigation did the best they could under the circumstances. If you realise that you've got 6 million people living in London, okay, the Metropolitan Police have various sections all divided up, they're all given letters of the alphabet. Whitechapel was known as H Division, okay, the main sort of divisional station was at Leman Street, at the heart of this, and that's where major officers were based. So if you think in H Division, they only had, population of Whitechapel around 76,000. There was just over 500 officers. So 500 officers for over 76,000 people, that's a lot of ground to cover. And Sir Charles Warren actually said at the time, who's the commissioner of the police at the time, he actually turned around and said, the lads are working so hard on night duty at the moment to try and catch this murderer throughout the night. They are walking up to 20 miles a night on their beat duty. They did the best they could. There's no forensics in 1888, as we know. So there's no DNA, there's no offender profiling. Fingerprinting had been invented, don't get me wrong, but the police weren't using it at this point. I don't know if people know, but the first fingerprint department at Scotland Yard was not even in existence till 1901. And the first conviction for murder in this country from a fingerprint was not until 1905. So that science is just a few years away. They couldn't have that. So back then they produced 80,000 leaflets and put them throughout the doors, basically called to the occupier notice. You can see those on the internet. There's one came up for sale a few years ago in New York at Christie's and sold for about $30,000, this piece of paper. So if anybody finds one of those in their attic, hang on to it. So they did those. Basically, this little notice said, if you hear and see anything, help us, let us know. So witnesses really is the only way you're going to catch a serial killer back then, unless you see the murderer in the act of murder, which, what are the odds of that? Well, 0 really. And maybe a physical clue, but nothing was ever left.
And so the police were coming in for a lot of criticism as the murders, one murder succeeded another. They were getting into a bit of hot water for not being able to get anywhere near catching the killer.
So, tell me about the last murder location.
The last one was the most horrific of all, Mary Jane Kelly.
Mary Jane Kelly, unlike the victims that preceded her, 25-year-old Kelly was young and considered attractive.
It was about 6 weeks after the previous murders. This was in November 1888. The street that it was on has gone now, but it looked very much like this. It was called Dorset Street. And Dorset Street, as I mentioned earlier on, is one of the roughest and nastiest streets in London. She had a lodging in Miller's Court on Dorset Street.
So Mary Jane is still very much an enigma. We don't know much about her background. We've only really got information that she told to Joseph Barnett, who'd been living with her for a while as a boyfriend. So we've got information what he says and things that she told other people, but actually we've not found her in any of the records, even if Mary Jane Kelly was her real name. She's in her mid-20s, so she's the youngest of our victims. And she's living indoors. She has a room of her own, yet she's several weeks arrears in her rent. She's owing a lot of money. That in itself is quite intriguing because people say, well, normally if you owe only a few shillings or pennies, you're kicked out of your lodgings. So why is John McCarthy, her landlord, allowing her to stay there? There's been a few theories about that. Maybe she was related to John McCarthy. She's not buried that far from him in Leytonstone Cemetery. They're both Irish, they're both Catholic. She also claimed to have been related to a famous music hall star, and the McCarthy families were related to famous music hall stars at the time. So she may have been related, hence why he didn't kick her out of that particular room. Other people have argued that he was her pimp. He was actually, because she was young and beautiful, actually using her and actually watching her from the archway above going into Miller's Court where she was found. There was a room, and apparently according to the family, John would basically watch who's going in and out of the court, especially if he's like pimping her or, letting her do sex work. So she's an intriguing character.
The bailiffs from the landlord came round to try and get the rent. They knocked on the door, there was no reply. They went into the courtyard and they saw the rags and the paper stuffed in the window, so they pulled it away. And they saw the body of Mary Jane Kelly and the room absolutely covered in blood.
Oh, gosh.
They sent for the police. The police came, knocked on the door because it was locked. In the end, they broke it down. And what they saw was the most horrific thing, I think, that any policeman has ever actually even seen since.
And Mary Kelly, of course, was found inside her room at number 13 Miller's Court, lying on a bed, mutilated to a worse standard than any of the other victims, but he had spent a lot more time at the crime scene inside the room with the door shut, where he knew that nobody was going to come along. The police believed he'd actually set a fire burning in the room, said he had light to see what he was doing. But when the police got there, she was lying again on her back with her legs apart, one hand across her chest, her throat had been cut violently from right to left, which is the only time that happens in the Ripper case. All the other ones were left to right. She was found one hand in the chest, one hand by her side, her intestines pulled from inside her across the right shoulder. A number of organs had actually been removed from inside her body. Her liver was lying beneath her feet. Dr. Phillips, who was the police divisional surgeon for the Metropolitan Police, said that both breasts and the muscles attached to them had been removed with roughly circular incisions. One of them was under the left side of her face with both of her kidneys and her uterus. The other was under the heel of her right foot. Intestines down the side of the body. There was blood up the wall. The police report stated that when they got there, actually strips of flesh, it was described as, were actually hanging from nails in the wall and across the backs of the chairs in the room. At that particular crime scene as well, he'd mutilated her face very heavily, to such a point where there wasn't really much of her face left. You can see in that horrible picture of her on the bed, there's part of her forehead left. Some people say she was described, she was identified by her ear. I don't know how realistic that is, but that's the level of mutilation I'm talking about.
The way she was found on the bed, she was clearly going to sleep, because we now know, although the scene of crime photograph shows her nearest the bed edge towards the camera, where she was actually killed was the other side of the bed by the wall. So it's as though, she's clearly, whoever it is, either she knows him, okay, and she's comfortable in his presence, or she's having a sexual transaction and the man says, well, let's just get into bed, we'll go to sleep and I'll stay the night.
And she'd laid down on the bed with her nightdress on, so she was obviously quite comfortable with the man that she was with. She was either a client or somebody she knew quite well.
But she goes against the wall, and that's where the throat is then cut, because the blood seeps through to the floor and the sprays all over the walls. But yeah, so she obviously felt very comfortable, whether that's someone she knew or whether that was a stranger.
He had this time got time. All the other murders had been taking place in about 10 minutes. But this time, he had got time to really get to work on it.
And because Jack could spend all night dissecting her body, hers is definitely the worst. And if we do see the scene of crime photograph, and I should say the scene of crime photograph of Mary Jane is the earliest one in this country's history. So it's not very nice, but it's really important as a historical document, and we're so lucky it survived.
But to this day, I don't think any police force in Britain has seen anything like it. It was interesting because it's the first time that there was a crime scene photograph taken. So there's actually a photograph, several photographs, of Mary Jane Kelly's body, and they are appalling. Even though they're black and white and grainy, they are the most appalling pictures. And of course, some people have colorized them now, but there were photographs of her body. Absolutely horrific.
Were there any pictures of her before this photo taken?
Yes, there's one photograph of her. Yes, most of the girls, actually, there were photographs of them. And there were photographs of her, but dressed in her finery.
Why do you think nobody discovered her sooner that night?
Because she was at home. She was used, I think, and they knew that she was a prostitute. She was an alcoholic, of course. And she was also, actually, strangely enough, quite a lot younger than the other girls. She was 25. The others were all in their 40s.
Oh, wow.
And I think this was the lifestyle that she had. She took men home. It wasn't her boyfriend. It was somebody who was a client to earn her money.
I think the reason why, sort of she's interrupted is the middle of the night, everybody's sleeping.
Yeah.
She's sort of last heard, we think possibly around 4 a.m. by the lady living upstairs, Elizabeth Prater. Mary Jane's in the room below her, because Elizabeth suddenly wakes up when her cat, called Diddles, walks across her chest. Maybe that cat had heard something, maybe that cat was a bit frightened, so went to its mistress, because at that time Elizabeth then hears a cry of, "Oh, murder." So people have then thought, wow, we've got a witness. Maybe she heard Mary Jane crying out, but I don't think so. If we look at that again, Elizabeth says, oh no, it didn't come from down there, which was the area it's going to come from. That crying came from out there in the court. Well, it can't have been Mary Jane crying that out, but who was? Who was crying that out? We still don't know. That's another mystery within the mystery.
Yeah.
Did somebody actually come to the window and see
the murder.
her lying on that bed at 4 or 5 a.m. and then just fled for their own safety? I guess we'll never know.
Then after that, although we do see another couple of murders, on the 17th of July, 1889, was the murder of Alice Mackenzie and the murder of Frances Coles on the 13th of February, 1891. We would never see that kind of mutilation again. So Alice Mackenzie was mutilated to a much lesser degree. She had 2 knife injuries to her throat. There was a knife wound on her jawline, but the police believe that might have been caused as her throat was cut if she'd perhaps brought her neck down to protect herself, and he cut an incision into her face, but he might not have intended to do that. There were fingernail marks where it would appear that he'd scratched and pulled at her abdomen, cut a number of fairly superficial knife injuries, and then taken off running at that crime scene. At the murder of Frances Coles, while her throat was cut violently and she was posed up as the other victims were, she hadn't been mutilated, but police officer Ernest Thompson of the Metropolitan Police had actually arrived at that scene seemingly seconds after the murder took place, and said he actually heard somebody running out of the other end of the railway arch as he got there. That must surely have been the killer, and he disturbed him in the act. So she wasn't mutilated like the rest of them. As we go through the case, we see what they call an escalating level of violence, with Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly in particular being the most violent, most disturbing crime scenes.
Why in particular do you think they kind of stopped after, let's say, Mary Jane Kelly's murder, who is quite graphic, very mutilated? Why do you think that they started to phase out, or there's less evidence in regards of like his sexual fantasies with the rest of them?
Well, I mean, with the 2 murders that took place after Mary Kelly, he might have been unhappy with the crime scene. He seems to have been interrupted at the Frances Coles crime scene. But then after, even if you agree that those were committed by the same man, he really does seem to disappear after that. After the murder of Mary Kelly, he might have felt intimidated by the police presence in the area. Everybody was talking about this. It was such a big deal, and there was such pressure to find the killer. He might have been forced to lay low for a while, but when the murders certainly stopped after that, he might perhaps have gone to prison or moved away or died or any of these kind of things. But I would also say today there's a number of things that could force him to stop doing what he's doing. So if he was living by himself at the time of the murders, he may have found his living circumstances changed. Now he has to go and live with other people all packed into one room, and he's sane and sensible enough to not want his death penalty appointment. So he may have been forced. So maybe he could have got married and had a couple of kids. He could have got a job. Maybe he's got to get down the shipyards now at 4:30 in the morning. And if he doesn't do that, he's going to lose the place he's living in. He's going to sleep in the streets. He's not going to be running around the streets drunk, high as a kite, murdering people at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Did he feel any pressure or remorse or feel that he was going to get caught by so much coverage?
He might potentially have felt intimidated by that. Some killers might follow the reports in the newspaper, which he may or may not have. Other killers might not pay any attention at all to it. He just does what he wants to do. And whatever. But I think when there's a big gap, particularly between the double murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and then the 6 weeks later murder of Mary Kelly, he might potentially have felt intimidated. From his point of view, there's a lot of pressure on him. Nobody is talking about anything else. The newspapers are talking about nothing else. Yes, I don't think it would influence the things he wants to do with the crime scenes. But for example, when Catherine Eddowes was murdered and half of her apron was taken from Mitre Square, and it was then dumped in the doorway of 108 to 119 Wentworth dwellings, he might have just absent-mindedly thrown that there. He might have wanted to discard evidence in case anybody saw him with it, or he might potentially have dumped that in the doorway to increase his notoriety. And if he did do that for that reason, it would appear that he was following the newspapers, and rather than being intimidated by it, he was reveling in it and wanted to be more notorious than he already currently was.
So tell me about the nature of these killings. What sort of profile or psychological profile it creates about the killer?
In a modern case, they would say that the killer is acting out a fantasy that he has in his head. So at some point, he has seen, heard, read about something that excites him, and he's attempting to act this out at the crime scene. He's put a great deal of thought into what he wants to do before he actually goes out and commits an offence. So by the time he goes to commit his first murder, he's already decided what he wants to do, what type of victim he wants to target, what type of weapon he wants to use, what sort of injuries he wants to inflict, and he has a very well-rehearsed fantasy in his head of what he wants to do, and this is what you see him acting out at the crime scene. So something he's influenced by something to do this, and after thinking about this and obsessing over this for a period of time, he's reached a point where his desire to commit this offence and get the satisfaction that he knows he will get from doing it outweighs his worries of being caught or getting a death penalty or having people know who he is. And yes, the reason he's doing it is because he wants to act out that fantasy that he has, and he's a sexually motivated offender.
If you look at modern situations like that, we have things like Peter Sutcliffe, which was the modern-day equivalent. He taunted the police. He played at being quicker than the police. He created awful things to the victims. It was copycat to that behaviour. That behaviour would have been from a very sick mind, or someone, as in the case of Charles Cross, who had experience of working with butchery. Certainly with psychosis, being able to switch off your emotions when you're dealing with such horrific things. Look at someone who works in an abattoir. They don't think anything of killing as part of their daily work, and yet other people would see that as horrific. They've managed to block off that way of thinking. So by today's standards, we would look scornfully at some of those instances, but that might have been more commonplace to those individuals at that time.
It would be an obsessive thought. He would sit daydreaming about it, fantasizing about it, picturing in his head, rehearsing in his head how he's going to do it, how he's going to meet the victim, what it's going to feel like to do these things. So by the time he goes out to do it, he knows exactly what he wants to do, and that's why you keep seeing the same things at each crime scene. He's repeatedly acting out this fantasy he has, and if he hadn't stopped and he'd kept going, you would expect to see more of this happening again.
Yeah. Do you think he has a certain image of the type of woman that he wants to act on?
Yes. So all of the victims, give or take, are about the same age. They're about the same height. They're all dressed in black at the time the murders took place. Again, today they would refer to that as a killer's victim profile. So again, he didn't just wake up this morning and decide to go murdering. He doesn't murder everybody he meets. He meets his victims randomly by chance in the street, but it's not a coincidence that every time he commits a murder, the victim has a lot in common was the last one. He meets them randomly in the street, but he waits until somebody fitting that image that he has in his head comes along.
Right, so there's no prior motive, like you don't believe that he knew these women?
It doesn't seem so. No, it seems the police believed what he would do. He would sit drinking in the local pubs. He lived somewhere in the immediate area, and it was the opinion of the police at the time that he would sit drinking in the local pubs. Then, when they kick him out, 12:30, 1 a.m, which was closing time, instead of just going home, he goes for a walk around the streets, possibly mildly intoxicated, looking for opportunities. So if he doesn't see an opportunity, he'll go home, and you'll think nothing of it. But if he meets somebody in the street, a desperate woman in a darkened street, he has a plan how he's going to lure her to that spot. He only met you 2 minutes ago. It wasn't a personal thing in that sense, but he's looking for somebody that fits that description that he can act out his fantasies with. So he would meet somebody randomly in the street, do the deed, run like hell. He only lives 2 minutes away somewhere in the immediate area. So it was the opinion of the police that by the time the body was found, he's back in the living room. He's back in the house, and that's what he would do.
So tell me a bit more about the suspects and who you kind of believe were to be suspects, or who was a common suspect at the time of the investigation.
If you were to Google Jack the Ripper suspects, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of names appear, but almost all of these have been put forward from the 70s onwards, and most of them are nonsensical and have no evidence to back them up. At the time the murders took place and the investigation was going on, there were only really 2 suspects who were considered at the time. The first one was a guy called John Pizer, who was sometimes known as Leather Apron. Particularly after the murder of Annie Chapman, the police had been asking a lot of women in the area, have you seen any intimidating individuals? Is anybody threatening you in the street? And a number of people said, yes, there's this guy. He hangs on a commercial street. He wears a leather apron like a blacksmith. He's got a big knife. And you'd be walking up the street. He would jump out and threaten you, give me your money or I'll kill you, this kind of thing. And it must be him. He's not bluffing. And then the police found him. His name was John Pizer. He was like a street mugger kind of guy, but he had an airtight alibi for the first 2 murders. When the first one took place, he'd actually been in Holloway and loads of people had seen him. When he left his lodging house in Holloway, he was then told that he was under suspicion, so he got into hiding where loads of people saw him. He had an airtight alibi and it wasn't him. That was the first suspect. The other one was a guy called Jacob Eisenschmidt. Jacob Eisenschmidt was also from Holloway, strangely enough. He was a butcher, and it would appear that his butcher's business had gone bust. His wife had contacted the police and said he's had some sort of breakdown, he's violent, he's drunk all the time, he carries these big knives with him, and he hangs out in a number of pubs in Wentworth Street in Whitechapel. And when it was realised he was missing from his lodging house on the night that Annie Chapman was murdered, there was a big manhunt to find him. They found him, he was taken to court. The judge declared him to be a dangerous man. He was then locked up, but then the murders kept going, so it couldn't have been him either.
So the talk about a butcher and a doctor were really the attempts of people at the time to rationalize these crimes. Obviously, they didn't have terminology like serial killer. In fact, the term serial killer didn't come into common usage until the 1970s. So a long time after the murders had been committed. And people at the time, it was very difficult to get people to understand that murders could be committed without a motive. And so the people thought that there had to be a motive, there had to be some sort of explanation for this. And it was really terrifying for people to come to terms with the idea that there was somebody out there that you'd never hurt, who didn't know you, who would, for some reason, kill you. And that was really beyond comprehension. And people, therefore, started looking for an explanation. And that's really where the theorizing starts to come from, is because they weren't trying to put a name to the murderer. They were trying to put a purpose to the murderer. So you get the insane doctor, or the mad pork butcher, or the murderous midwife, or whatever character, the religious fanatic, and so forth. And all these different theories would would come about. And most of the early books and articles were working along those lines. And so we had stories being told, like a man called Leonard Matters in 1929 told a story about a Dr. Stanley. This doctor had apparently had a brilliant son who was a doctor also, and the son met Mary Kelly, one of the victims of Jack the Ripper, and got a disease from her, from which he died, and the death of the son made Dr. Stanley go peculiar, and he set out to destroy Mary Kelly and get vengeance on Mary Kelly. And on the way, as he was looking for, he was speaking to other women who were the other victims, until he finally murdered her. What Matters was doing was telling a story that would explain the murders as he saw it, and he was just trying to put the crimes into a storyline, without really, I think, intending anybody to believe that Dr. Stanley really existed. It would have been fairly easy to discover that he didn't. And even Matters admitted that that was a pseudonym that he'd made up for this doctor.
So could you tell me about some of the suspects that the police were quite definitive about?
The only thing that we've got that gives us an indication of serious suspects that were held by the police is a document called the McNaughton Memorandum, and that names that was written specifically because a newspaper had suggested that a person was the murderer, and the McNaughton wrote that that this chap wasn't the murderer, and he said that there were 3 people, any one of whom was more likely than this man, whose name was Cutbush. So there are 3 men more likely than Cutbush to have been Jack the Ripper. And then he went on to name 3 men: Montague John Druitt, somebody called Kosminski, and another man called Michael Ostrog. We now know that, in fact, Michael Ostrog was in an asylum in France at the time of the murderers, so we can discount him. McNaughton himself was focused on Montague Druitt, who was a barrister and also a school teacher, and he drowned himself towards the end of 1888 in the Thames. We actually don't know why McNaughton got that name or suspected Druitt, because there's nothing obvious about him to suggest that he would have been the murderer. And the other man, Kosminski, again, it is believed that Kosminski refers to a man called Aaron Kosminski, because Aaron Kosminski is the only K something ski that we know about who was committed to an asylum, which is what McNaughton said happened to the man he called Kosminski. Sir Robert Anderson was the head of the CID at the time of the murder, so he was in charge really of the police investigation overall. And we may assume he would have known the facts about every serious suspect. So his words on the case actually matter. And he wrote in his autobiography, he wrote that the identity of Jack the Ripper was known, and that he was a certain low-class Polish Jew, and he had been sent to an asylum. A man called Swanson, who was a chief inspector, he made some marginal notes in his personal copy of Anderson's autobiography. And in those notes, he refers to Anderson's suspect, and he says, and the suspect was Kosminski. It's weird that both Swanson and McNaughton should refer to this suspect just by the name of Kosminski without giving a Christian name. But it would appear that if we put all that together, we have McNaughton saying that because there were many circumstances that made Kosminski a good suspect. We have Anderson saying that his suspect was had been identified by somebody and had been committed to an asylum. And then we have Swanson identifying Anderson's suspect as Kosminski. So all three appear to have been referring to the same suspect.
Because there was a small piece of apron from her shawl, or from her apron, found outside a lodging house in Galston Street, which is not far from here, where we think the Ripper actually lived. Now, there was no DNA evidence in 1888, but that piece of cloth was kept. And astonishingly, in 2014, they applied DNA evidence, having picked up the DNA from those descendants, and also from their principal sort of suspect, a man called Aaron Kosminski.
So who was Aaron Kosminski?
Aaron Kosminski was a Polish Jew. He was a barber. He possibly also worked in the slaughterhouses. But he was mentally ill. And just after this murder, he was taken into a mental institution, and astonishingly, all the murders of this type stopped.
Before the murder of Annie Chapman, there was a lady called Emily Walter, had been attacked about 3 hours before. She said it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And it was in the same area, actually on Hanbury Street. She said she'd met a guy in the middle of the night who'd offered her this money to go with her. And she said she'd been very drunk at the time, but he seems to target them when they're drunk or vulnerable in some way, when you're by yourself and you're vulnerable. And she told the police that whoever this man was, she'd accompanied him to a backyard in one of the houses in Hanbury Street that was possibly number 29, she said. But once she'd got there, he'd attacked and tripped her up and strangled her, but she screamed and he ran away. And the description she gave was he was about 5'9". He was late 20s, early 30s, white guy with a beard and mustache at the Hanbury Street scene, pronounced Eastern European accent. But yes, there were very large numbers of people in the area who were white men in Victorian London with flat caps and jackets, and certainly in the East End, Eastern European accents. Along with other people, she did give a good description of the guy, but it was dark, you were drunk, and half the people in the area looked like that. So the police said even though they had these descriptions to go on, it wasn't really enough to point the finger at any one person in particular.
Well, the only thing is that the City of London police were very, very thorough in their crime scene. They took a complete list of everything that was by the body, within even the 40 tin of tea that she carried. But there was no mention of any shawl or part. So as with all of the Ripper clues, they still are to this day complete conjecture.
There was a fourth man who was mentioned by a policeman called Littlechild, who, writing a letter to a man called George R. Sims, he referred to a man called Tumblety.
There was another man called Dr. Francis Tumblety, who was an American, who was also a man who was known to not like women and slash women. And he disappeared to France and then back to America about the same time, straight after the murders.
Basically a quack doctor, an American quack doctor, who was here in Britain at the time of the murders. He was actually arrested on suspicion of being Jack the Ripper, but he was also arrested for homosexual offences at the time, and he fled back to America. And the policeman concerned, Littlechild, actually said in the letter that he referring to Tumblety not being a sadist, which he said Jack the Ripper obviously was. Whether he was a sadist or not, the fact is that if Tumblety, if Littlechild thought that Tumblety wasn't a sadist, and he thought Jack the Ripper was a sadist, then obviously he didn't think Tumblety could have been Jack the Ripper. How seriously we put Tumblety in the frame is open to question, but at least he was named by a policeman. So those are really the four primary suspects named by the police at the time, but that was by Sir Melville Macnaghten, who was writing several years after the crimes and who wasn't actually a policeman at the time they were committed. So that document has questions that we need to ask about it and look at.
If you look at the evidence, a chap by the name of Cross, who was actually seen by a policeman at the time and was implicated, would have been a better suspect. And he lived until 1920. His real name was actually Lechmere, as Charles Cross Lechmere, and he changed his name at the coroner's because he was called in as to give evidence, and he gave the wrong name. He gave the wrong address of where he was living, and he subsequently lived a very long life and was even photographed in 1920 as a quite successful man.
Wow.
He was actually working for a meat haulage company called Pickford's, which was on the same trajectory line on the map of all the killings, and the two killings which were out of that trajectory were where his mother lived with his daughter, who was living with his mother. So there's a lot of more links and circumstantial evidence which say they should have looked at him more carefully.
What's interesting is that the suspect's file, as it was known, has been missing for many years. We don't know when it went. Certainly the investigation regarding the number of officers on the beat and other investigations started to be less and less around 1892. Officers are now being taken off that to do other police duties. We don't know when things were filed. I mean, to be fair, because Jack was never caught, the case files for the ladies' murders are still technically still open.
Yeah.
They've not been closed. You tend to only close a file if it's solved.
So could you tell me a bit more about how now these women are held in memorabilia and how there is tributes paid to them, if there are any?
So we do know where all the victims are buried, and that includes the possible earlier attacks as well, of Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram. Some people believe they were Ripper victims, some don't. I personally don't think they were Ripper victims, I have to say, but they're still part of the story. We didn't know where those two ladies were buried, but we knew where the 5 victims were over the years. And over the years, many of them are in the same cemetery at the City of London Cemetery, and Polly and Catherine had beautiful little roundels made with their names on. So Annie even has a brand new memorial, Annie Chapman, a new memorial in Manor Park Cemetery, which was just put there only a few weeks ago. So it's brand new. It's sort of like a little obelisk type thing, and she's even got her own little path up to it, which is almost like a celebrity in the churchyard, which is a bit strange, but it's really lovely she has that. Elizabeth Stride's also in another cemetery. She has actually now got a gravestone provided by the cemetery. Polly and Catherine are in the same one, and then Mary Jane, because all of these ladies were in unmarked graves, I should say, to begin with. Okay, so it's only over the years the cemetery have done stuff. Someone's put a little headstone. Mary Jane's had a few memorials over the year. The current one has got a little quotation on it, and people like myself and other historians, we go there every year, look after the graves. We go on the anniversaries, we place flowers, and we do little ceremonies and light candles and things like that. But what I'm really proud to say, and you'll see some pictures, is that this year, after years of attempting, we managed to finally get 2 new plaque roundels for Emma Elizabeth Smith, Martha Tabram, and also Annie Millwood, who was also attacked in 1888 and subsequently died, and her murderer was never found. If she was murdered, she was attacked and she died a month later, so people do think her illness may have become brought on from that attack. So we have, you'll see from the pictures, the 3 new roundels. I was the first person to discover where the ladies were buried, probably 10, 15 years ago. And it's taken that long because of cemetery rules and regulations and new staffing coming in. But this year we managed to get the roundels done. So it's been the first time ever that we've been able to have a ceremony a few weeks ago for Martha Tabram at actually her memorial.
That's amazing. Are there any known relatives of these women still that you know?
So we don't know of any relatives of Emma Elizabeth Smith. Martha Tabram, I've met one of her descendants many years ago, and she did show me a photograph. The family do have a photograph of Martha, but sadly they've chosen not to release that. I've met descendants from Polly and Catherine as well over the years. So there are definitely descendants around from these ladies. And it would be nice to one day, for respect for the families really, so they could lay the ghosts of their ancestors to rest, to know who Jack was, because their families still exist. So it would be nice to solve it for the families, so they could rest in peace.
Do you think the police techniques now have brought down the rate of unsolved murder cases?
Well, it's still, if you look at the figures, there's still 10% of murders are unsolved. And that equates to 10-year periods, a lot of murders which no one knows about.
Yeah.
And if they do know about them, they still haven't got the evidence to support any kind of prosecution. The CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, are very adept at finding the evidence and putting together a case, but they don't always win. And even with today's science, we still don't manage to convict and profile the right people.
Do you think that kind of fuels the true crime obsession with mystery and the fact that we won't ever really solve these crimes?
With equating to the Jack the Ripper,
Yeah.
it certainly is why it is, in 120 years, still one of the biggest mysteries of policing.
It's difficult to say if we found out the truth behind Jack the Ripper, but we've definitely found out a lot more details, a lot more concise details, a lot more human details, again, giving us more context of Whitechapel in 1888. There was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of alcoholism, escapism, and murder. And it was really interesting to know how the police tackled that and how they would have, in contrast, had a bit more expertise in science and forensics today, and how they kind of lacked that in the past. It was also interesting to know how the papers manipulated potential suspects and how it kind of contributed to the extensive list of suspects we still have today. Jack the Ripper case may never be solved, but we are still interested in it 120 years on.